Hi there, this is Cory Doctorow, and you're listening to my podcast. This is part 7, the final installment of There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow, Now is the Best Time of Your Life, my new novella, which I've just finished. As I mentioned in the last podcast, this is canned. This introduction is being recorded minutes after finishing my last podcast, because this week I'm in Croatia at the International Creative Commons Summit. So I'm not sure what I'm going to read after this. I have an interesting plan. I'm going to see what comes of it. But next Sunday, tune in. Next weekend, tune in and hear what goes on. Because if all goes according to plan, I'm going to be doing something pretty fun and weird. Okay, without any further ado, the final installment of There's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow. Now is the best time of your life. Good thing I did, too. I found a gray hair on my eyebrow within a week. Within a month, the hair on my chest had gone white, and the wrinkles had spread from the corners of my eyes to the tops of my arms. 6 months later, I needed a cane. Within a year, it was 2 canes. It was the stuff in my marrow, of course. All those borrowed years, undone with a single injection. I tried to shut them down using the console, but they weren't responding. I presume that somewhere, Chennai maybe, some colleague of Chandrasekhar would be fascinated to hear about this. Someone who'd love to know about the long-term outcomes in his experiment. Being that long-term outcome was less fun. I piloted my mecha up the walls of the treehouse on Sugarloaf Key. The bottom floors have something wrong with them, some mutant gene that caused their furnishings to extrude from the ceiling and walls. The upper floors were all right though, and I have very simple needs. Climbing out of the mecha gets harder every day. Just looking at my body gets harder, to tell the truth. The wrinkles, the liver spots, the swollen joints. My physical age is impossible to guess, but I feel like I'm 120, a skeleton wrapped in papery skin. Every vein stands out, every bone, every joint. I inched down the limb of the treehouse and into my room. I had a little air-breathing radio oven and a narrow bed padded with dried boughs from the tree. There was a comfortable sofa that I'd improved with a couple big pillows. It was more than I needed. By the time I got home from a day's foraging, there wasn't anything to do except choke down a little food and rest my bones until my bladder got me up, which it did, like clockwork, every 2 hours, all night long. There are a lot of things I try not to dwell upon. The fact that this is all my fault is one of those things. It was later that night, the third or fourth time that I stumbled to the oubliette for yet another piss, that some sound caught me and brought me to the door. I'm not sure what it was. Nightimes are a riot of ocean noises, animal sounds, insect sounds, wind soughing through the boughs. Something was different that night. I took up my canes and tottered to the door, leaning on the jamb. My mecha stood before me, cheap and nasty and lethal, a silhouette in the moonlight. I looked out into the windows, I looked out into the woods, looked down at the floor, and finally I looked up. He was sitting on one of the high, thin branches of my treehouse. He was wearing loose pantaloons that hung in folds around his legs, a tight zippered jacket, and a confusion of rings and necklaces. It was dark, and he was all in shades of gray, except for his luminous white face, peering at me from his hood and his halo of elaborately braided hairs. "Hello there," he said. He seemed to be on the verge of laughing at some private joke, and somehow I knew that I wasn't the butt of it. "Sorry to wake you. We have business to discuss. Can I come in?" I looked up at him, squinting. I thought about toggling the floodlights on my mecha, but decided that whatever he wanted, I wasn't in a position to deny it to him. Out of my mecha, I was helpless. He could knock me over with a puff of air. I backed away from the door, leaning on my canes, and jerked my chin at the insides of my place. "Guess so," I said. I struggled into a pair of shorts before hitting the lights. His pupils dilated with the telltale snap of night vision enhancements, so the shorts were redundant. He'd already seen everything. What did I have to be modest about anyway? He was tall and thin, his hair a mad ash-blonde dandelion clock around his face. He had a fox-like chin and nose, and a wide mouth that curled up at the corners in a profusion of dimples, making his smile look like a caricature. "Would you like tea?" I asked. It helped me sleep sometimes, and so I was in the habit of making tea in the middle of the night. "You make it with those chanterelles you pick?" I narrowed my eyes at him. "You know a lot about me." "It's not really like tea at that point, more like consommé, but I'll try some." I put the dried mushrooms in my tea egg and dropped it into a jar of water from the treehouse's condenser, then stuck it in the cooker, letting it figure out the timing and all. You know a lot about me, I said again. I know a lot about you, he agreed. He sat down on the edge of my bed. I helped design you. You want to know the truth? I knew your parents. I looked more closely at him. He barely seemed a day over 30, so he was telling me that he was an immortal then. About time I met another one. It's an interesting story. On the other hand, you could be a 30-year-old jerk who likes to snoop. I remember that time you came to Florida to get the Carousel of Progress. Your father slipped away one evening after dinner, told you to stay in your Mecca, told you he had an appointment with someone. He smiled and smiled, the corners of his mouth curling in on themselves. We talked all night long. He was very happy with how you were working out, but there were some improvements we agreed that he would make in the next generation. He loved the Carousel of Progress. It was almost impossible to get him to talk about anything else. Your mother? He said you didn't remember her. I do. A great beauty. Smart, too. Acid tongue. She could flay the skin off you at 1,000 miles distance over a mailing list. I followed your career very closely ever since. I felt I owed it to your father. Lost you for a while, but you turned up again in an Indian gentleman's research notes, a gentleman from IIT, Chandrasekhar. He had certain novel theories about transcription. As this is my area of specialty, I paid close attention. Given what I knew of your design, I could tell that his ideas wouldn't apply. On the other hand, I also knew something that you never suspected. Chandrasekhar's little friends in your bloodstream were also gathering a copy of your genome for someone else's use. Don't know if old Racecar was in it or not, but I wouldn't put it past him. Dude's always been jealous of my mad genomic skills. But it's no coincidence that the Midwich Plague came along within a few years of you taking the cure. Those little bastards are spreading around the world like a pandemic. I forgot about the tea. The cooker shrilled at me a few times, but I couldn't do anything about it. I was transfixed. This guy clearly knew things that I'd wondered about all my life, like my operating parameters, like my parents' life histories, like what happened to Detroit, like who made the youth gangs. The cooker shut itself off. He laughed. His laugh was the oldest thing about him. It was positively ancient, and there wasn't a single nice thing about it. It snapped me back to myself. Why? I said. Why what? The corners of his mouth curled up another notch. Why are you here now? Why have you been watching me? Why haven't you come before? Just why? How about that tea? He stood up and helped himself. He took a sip. Delicious. More like consommé than tea, though. He took another sip, looked out into the night. I was pretty bummed when you took the cure. I could see where it was going to go. You were our little group's proudest moment, you know, the pinnacle of our achievement. I could tell from looking at Chandrasekhar's publications that it wasn't going to work out, and I could also read the writing on the wall. Someone was going to get hold of our work and set to work improving it. You're the only one, you know. As you might imagine, experimental verification of immortality is a long-term process, not the kind of thing you can do in a hurry. The plan was to let you run for half a century or so before the rest of us had our own kids. He laughed again, that old laugh. Pretty silly to think that there'd be anything recognizable left after 50 years. It's easy to believe that you understand the future just because you've got a reasonable handle on the present, I guess. The raid on Detroit was about getting you, you know. Your genome, anyway. Originally, the plan had been to seduce you, but that wouldn't have gotten your whole genome, just the zygotic half you left behind. Anyway, it was made irrelevant by the fact that the tree huggers weren't about to let their daughter be deflowered by an inhuman monster. So instead, they raided you. Your father died to keep you safe. Then what do you do with that legacy? Piss it away because you don't like your protracted adolescence. You would have aged eventually, you know, if it had all gone according to plan. You were impatient, and now, well, look at you. You're certainly paying the price for it, aren't you? Leave. I hadn't known that that was what I was going to say until I said it. Once I said it again. Leave. Now. I was seeing red. How dare he blame me for what happened to me? He laughed, and that didn't endear him to me at all. Oh, Jimmy, you're letting your ego get ahead of your good sense again. You needn't be condemned to repeat the mistakes of your past, you know. You can choose otherwise. I haven't answered one of your questions yet. Why now? Because I can reverse it. I can undo what Chandrasekhar did. It's my area of specialty, after all. I can make you young again. Leave, I said. I didn't believe him for a moment. He laughed. I'll come back later, once you've had a chance to think it over. The next day, climbing to my Mecca hurt more than usual. The heat arrived early that day, so I woke up in a sweat. The tree's sap tap yielded sweet water that was already sickly warm, but I drank cup after cup of it before suiting up. It could keep me going all day. I barely looked at my room as I left it, not wanting to see the 2 cups by the sink, the evidence that I hadn't dreamt my visitor in the night. The Mecca's cargo pouch bulged with my week's foraging, irregular lumps of concrete that still betrayed a few human-made, razor-sharp edges, angles you just couldn't find anywhere in a post-Wumpus world, half a steel-belted radial that had rested under a rock where the Wumpuses had missed it, and the great prize, a whole bag of tampon applicators, what the locals called beach whistles, discovered in a dried-out septic tank up on Little Duck Island. This was my living, collecting the junk of our erased civilization. I knew an assemblage sculptor who'd pay handsomely for it in processed cereals, refined sugars, and all the other old evils that were nearly impossible to derive from the utopian plants that sprouted all around us. There were sweet edible flowers that you could put in your tea, there were mushroom loaves that tasted like whole grain bread, but there weren't any Twinkie bushes or cigarette trees. The thing about the main road is that you can see down it for a long, long way, so theoretically it should be hard for the youth gangs to stage an ambush. And the old roadbed was kept smooth by the passage of feet, yielding a less bumpy ride in the Mecca, which was a comfort to my old bones. I stayed away from the road from a little before dusk to a little after dawn. The youth gang grew more fearless then, or so it seemed to me, and they owned all the high traffic routes after dark. But it's not a hard and fast rule. That day, they surrounded me on the road, moving like they were on casters, that same eerie precision. It had been 5 years since I'd last met a youth gang in the woods at the eve of the militia's dissolution, but I still recognized these kids. They were the same kids, not just similar looking, the same kids. I'd never forget their faces. They hadn't aged a day. Again, I rotated my Mecca at the waist, looking at each in turn. They met my gaze calmly. They were filthy now, so grimed that they were all the same mottled brown and green. One appeared to have fungus growing on his shirt. 2 were barefoot. They looked like they needed a parent to sit them down and bathe them and put them in a new suit of clothes and administer a spanking. I found the one I'd chased to his hidey hole, the one who'd move with so much preternatural grace and agility. I gave the Mecca his scent, told it to track him, only him, to grab him, no matter what. Then I spun around a little, looking a different one in the eyes, hoping to trick them all about the focus of my attention. They each raised an arm in unison and tried to mind rape me. The headache returned, the same headache, bookmarked and reloaded 5 years later, and I slapped at the activator control as it descended. Fetch, Mecca! Fetch! The Mecca lurched and spun and grabbed in a series of clicks and thuds. I told it to put itself into relentless pursuit mode, without any consideration for me. I heard one of my ribs snap, and gasped. The old rib was the same one that had snapped all those years before. The headache disappeared, swallowed by the pain in my chest. I felt the rib ends grating, had a momentary vision of the sharp rib end puncturing through my lung. The Mecca would be my grave. It would chase the boy and catch him or not, and I would bubble out my last bloody breaths, immortal no longer. But we were lurching too hard for me to spend time on these visions. The boy was running and dodging through the jungle, again choosing his route based on the Mecca's limitations, the places it couldn't leap or smash through. I took over the controls and added my smarts to the Mecca, trying to model the boy's behavior and guess where he would go next. There, he was going to jump into that swampy patch and pull himself out along that old rotting log. So coil the legs and spring, aiming for the log, doubling over in the air and grabbing for him. Little fucker wasn't going to generation gap me again. I did it, roared into the air and roared at the pain in my ribs. Caught him on the first bounce, wrapped my hands around his skinny chest and turned him right side up and held him in front of my faceplace. He was eerily calm. I could feel him trying to work his way into my head, his squid battering my mind. I flipped on my PA. "Cut it out," I said. I was breathing hard, each inhale agony from my ribs. "Why can't you little creeps just leave me alone?" "Jimmy," he said, "what have you done to yourself?" And he spoke in my father's voice. I think I blacked out for a while. I don't know how long I was out, but then I was back and he was just disappearing into another hidey hole, his scrap of a shirt still caught in my Mecca's fist. I grabbed for him, but the pain in my ribs nearly made me black out again. I switched on the Mecca's medical stuff and let the needles and probes sink into me while I set the inertial tracker to backtrack, gently, to home. I could see my artist friends some other time and do my trade. The man with the rings and necklaces and the dandelion clock of hair was waiting for me when I got back. "That was some chase scene," he said, as I pried myself out of my tin can. "Hand me my canes," I gasped, stepping out onto the wide limb that led into my treehouse. He shook his head as he did so. "You don't look so good. You want to tape up my ribs?" "Not especially," he said. He rummaged in his pack and then tossed me something. "Compression shirt. Just put it on and let it do its thing." In the end, he had to help me into the t-shirt, which was snug and electric blue. It gradually tightened itself around me, like a full-body hug. He showed me how to get it to loosen up for later when I wanted to take it off. I slumped into my bed. "What have you done to yourself?" he said. "You're the second person to ask me that today." "Yeah, I heard." "You've been following me, huh?" He pointed around to the sky. "Midges," he said, "my familiars. I have millions of them, all around these parts. They keep me filled in on all the doings on my territory." "Your territory." "I'm the shaman of the Southlands, son. You should be honored. Most people don't even know I exist. I've come to you twice." "You said you could reverse this," I said, gesturing with my skeletal, liver-spotted arms. "I said that. It's not hard, really. Just need to send a kill signal to Chandrasekhar's bots, and your cell's natural robustness will kick in, lengthening your mitochondria. Once it reaches the critical length, bam, you'll just grow back into the boy we programmed you to be." "I want to stop at 18, I said. "That was a good age." He nodded sagely. "That might take the last couple thousand years off your life, you know." "How many will that leave me with, though?" "Oh, lots," he said. "I mean, none into the stelliferous period when the stars grow cold, but put it this way. Plate tectonics will have rendered the Earth's continents unrecognizable." "I thought you said that it took a long time to judge the success of immortality." "I've got really good models. Lots of compute power these days, if you know where to look." "All right, then. Do it. Make me young." "Ah, well, there's the little matter of payment, see? Always pay for what you get. There's no other way to run a world." His smile curled in and in, the dimples multiplying. "I have half an old tire I could let you have," I said, shrugging and slumping back into my bed. "I guess you could have the mecha once I recovered." He nodded. "Mighty generous of you, but I had something else in mind. A favor." I closed my eyes, knowing that this was going to be bad. "It's those kids. You heard what the one that caught you said to you. He's not himself anymore. The Midwich virus turns kids into harvesters for a vast upload space where models of the consciousness of billions of humans exist in a hive mind." "They do what now?" "They steal your mind and put it in a big computer." "Why?" "Because they're programmed to. Whoever designed the Midwich virus wants them to. The Second Wumpus War was the same thing. Those human-attacking Wumpuses were scanning and copying the humans they ate. I think that the Midwich hive mind has assimilated the Wumpus mind, but I don't know for sure. Maybe they're rivals." "But why?" He shrugged. "You know the answer. We both do. They do it because someone thought that it would be cool. The line between thought and deed is pretty fine these days." "And why me?" "Jimmy," he said, sounding disappointed. "You know the answer. You're not stupid. You're our superhuman. Start acting like one." "Why you?" "Because the youth gangs have no effect on me." "Yes, and?" "Because they're derived from me somehow." "Yes, and?" "Because my father is in there somehow." "Yes, that's a weird one, isn't it? We all assumed he was dead. Maybe he was in cold storage, awaiting scanning. Maybe they scanned him right away." "What do you want of me?" "That part's easy," he said. I'd spent so much time ducking youth gangs, but now I was actively seeking them out. Perversely, I couldn't find them. I stuck to the main roads, ranging up and down the keys, letting the mecha drive itself while I kept my eyes out for them. It was one of those perfect days on the Keys when the sun was a cloudless blue to forever, the air scented with delicious wet jungle smells. I took a break and did a little fishing, using the mecha's radar to spot and plot the fish, then diving forward and snapping up a big grouper and cupping it in the mecha's hands while it thrashed. I put it in a refrigerated compartment on one thigh for later. I loved to pack them in mud, build a fire, and put them in among the coals. It had been a long time since I'd had fish, but I'd have something to celebrate tonight. I jogged up and down the Keys some more. I came to the place where I'd run into the youth gang the day before and checked to see if the mecha had still buffered the route it took chasing my little friend. It had. I set the inertial tracker to rerun it, letting the shaman's brace do the work. I came to it, an unimpressive hill covered in scrub, the entrance to the cave hidden by branches. I dug at the hill with the mecha's huge hands. It was slow going. An hour later, I had barely made a dent in the hill, and I still hadn't found any of the kids. The tunnel twisted and dipped around the tree roots. Fuck it. Once upon a time, my mecha had an enormous supply of short-range missiles, not nearly so smart as the ones on my original beast back in Detroit, but still able to get the job done. When I walked out of the militia, I had the good sense to fill up my frame, the dozen-by-dozen grid that held a gross of explosives. Over the years, they'd been depleted. The last couple I'd fired hadn't detonated on contact, but had gone up a few moments later. Luckily, I'd had the good sense to keep back at the unexploded munitions. I backed off from the hill and sighted down the tunnel. The flavors of missile I had left were really anti-personnel, low on heat, high on concussion. I figured that if I could just get the missile deep enough into the hillside, the concussion wave would crack it open like an egg. I fired, and missed. The missile tried valiantly to steer itself into the hole that I'd told it to aim for, but it just wasn't up to it. It screamed into the top of the hill and blew, most of the concussion going up and out into the sky, making an incredible roar that the mecha's cowling did little to dampen. I waited for my head to stop ringing and fired another missile, correcting a little. This one went true, right down into the tunnel, down and down. I counted 1 hippo, 2 hippo, and whoom! There was a deep grump from down below the mecha, and the hill disintegrated into the sky. It exploded like an anthill in a hurricane, turning into gobs of mud that arced in all directions in a rapidly expanding sphere. Caught in it were flinders of tree root that stuck to my cowl and slid down slowly. For a moment I caught a glimpse of the crater I'd made, and then 2 huge trees, something derived from cypresses, toppled into it, followed by a great inrush of water from the surrounding water table. I waded in as the water rushed and swirled and I scooped my arms through the soup, looking for evidence of the youth gang that had burrowed there, but whatever evidence there had been was now gone. I'd had visions of the hill opening like a stone, splitting dryly and revealing a neat cross-section of the tunnels inside. Hadn't really thought about the water table. The mud was sucking dangerously at the mecha's legs. If I got stuck here and had to abandon it, I'd never be able to walk out of the swamp on my own. I levered myself out of the sinkhole and stepped out into the world. I was covered in mud. The skin of the mecha would shed the dirt eventually, but for now, my shiny metal carapace was covered in disgusting, reeking glop. I was clearly not going about this right. I moved out onto the road and headed for the Sugarloaf Key Bridge. The Wumpuses had left the bridges intact. Otherwise, how would they make their ways up and down the keys? And they were the most conspicuous remaining example of human life in the good old days. It was the bridges that the youth gang staked out most avidly. It was there that I'd find them. Being covered in mud had its advantages. I crouched under the bridge, amid the rocks, and made myself invisible. I set the mecha to estivate and recharge its batteries, leaving only its various ears and eyes open. Before shutting down, I primed my whole remaining missile battery, getting them aimed for fast launch, and recorded a macro for getting myself out of there when the time came, before the bridge could come down around my ears. It would be quite a bounce, but I was prepared to give up a rib or two, if that's what it took. Now it was just a matter of staying alert. I kept thinking about my mouth-watering fish and the feast I'd cooked that night, drifting off into reverie. Then I'd snap back to my surroundings, looking back at my screens. Nothing. 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 Then, something. Gliding out of the wilderness at both ends of the bridge like they were on casters, silent, eerie, I waited for them to converge on the center of the bridge before I hit it and quit it. Kerblam! I barely had time to take satisfaction in the incredible, synchronized explosion of the struts at both ends of the bridge giving way, tossing lumps of reinforced concrete high into the sky. I was in the belly of the mecha as it sprang away, leaping nearly as high, landing with coiled legs, pushing off, somersaulting in midair, coming down, blam, blam, 1 foot, 2 foot, on the remaining section of bridge, snatching out with both hands, seizing a wriggling child in each hand, knocking their heads together, and leaping away. I let the mecha pilot itself for a while I kept an eye out for pursuit. They'd all scattered when I chased them before, but that didn't mean that they'd do the same when I caught a couple of them. There they were, giving chase, leaping over obstacles, skittering through the dirt, and ahead, more of them, a dozen of them, gliding out of the bush. A couple hours ago, I hadn't been able to find them. Now they were boiling out of the underbrush. I wasn't sure what they could do to my mecha, but I didn't want to find out. The mecha's arms pumped for balance, flailing the kids' bodies back and forth like rag dolls. I tried to get a look at them. I'd snatched up my little friend and one of his buddies, darker skinned with longer hair. Both had blood on their faces. Either the missile concussion had done that, or I had, when I'd banged their heads together. Like I said, not a lot of fine motor control in these mecha suits. I was breathing hard and it hurt like hell. Felt like another rib had cracked. Aging was coming on pretty quick. Here's the thing. The mecha had some pretty heavy guns, regular old-fashioned projectile weapons. I hadn't fired them much in the line of duty, because wumpuses are missile jobs unless you want to chip at them away all day on full auto. So my clips were full. I could have sprayed those kids as they came out of the jungle, short, auto-targeted bursts. I'm pretty sure that however immortal the little bastards were, they weren't immortal enough to survive 10 or 20 explosive rounds in the chest and head. Why didn't I shoot the kids? Maybe it's because I knew they were my brothers. Maybe I just couldn't shoot kids, even if they weren't kids. Maybe I could plan a neat little explosion and kidnapping, but not gun my enemies down face to face. The shaman said he needed the kids brought to him at the old Fine's Bite in the Saddlebunch Keys. That was pretty rough terrain, jungle and swamp the whole way, but the mecha knew how to get there. One of the kids was thrashing now, trying to get free. The mecha's gyros groaned and creaked as it tried to compensate for the thrashing and the weird terrain. I dropped the kid. I only needed one. I watched him fall in the rear view as the mecha leapt a hillock and went over double, using its free hand as a stabilizing leg, running like a three-legged dog. That was when one of the kids came down on my mecha's back, clinging to it. I could see the kid through the cowl, its face completely expressionless as its eyes bored into me. The youth gang squid needs more than one node to be fully effective. They can't pwn your mind on their own, but that doesn't mean that the one kid is helpless. Far from it. It felt like my head was slowly filling with blood, crushing my brain and making my eyes bug out. Red mist around the edges of my vision and blood roared in my red mist crept around the edges of my vision and blood roared in my ears like the ocean. I couldn't move anything. I almost smiled. Idiot child. If I couldn't move, I couldn't divert the mecha, and it knew where it was going. You're the only one that can run this mission, the shaman said, sitting in my treehouse. You're the only one that can just think that they can't just think to death. You may have spoiled your immortality, but that's still intact. You and them, you're all on the same footing. Bring one to me. I'm going to get a login to their little hobby world. I'm going to blow it wide open. We'll be able to go there without having our minds raped by those little pin dicks. I didn't exactly black out. My vision contracted to a hazy disk ringed by red-black pulses timed to my heartbeat, and I could barely hear. But I hadn't blacked out. I was still conscious. So I saw more kids drop onto the mecha's canopy as we galloped towards Saddlebunch. Some slid off when we leapt and jumped, but most stayed on. They had ropes. They lashed themselves down. They did something under the mecha, too, lassoing the legs, it seemed, from the little I could see, working without any facial expression. Again, leaping free, holding onto the ropes. I felt the mecha jerk as the ropes went taut, skidding and tumbling. Then it was up again, running again, on its feet again. Ropes! Inside, I smiled. Idiot kids. Over the surf roar of blood in my ears, I heard something else, new sounds, clattering, the ropes, something tied to the end of the ropes. The mecha jerked again, caught up short. Anchors, that's what it was. The mecha twisted from side to side, incidentally dislodging the child who'd stared at me through the carapace. The red haze receded, my muscles came back to me, and I leapt to my controls. I swung the mecha upright to give me more maneuverability and put my fingers on the triggers of all 4 guns. I rotated around to target the anchors behind me. A couple rounds severed the tight ropes. The kid who'd ridden my carapace was just getting to his feet beside the mecha. Another rattle of the guns took care of him, and he burst open. This is weird, but I'd never shot any person before. I'd blown up wumpuses and taken out the mechas and their drivers in Detroit, but I'd never done this before. There was an immediacy to the way he twisted and fell, the way his lungs opened out like wings from the holes the slugs tore in his back. It froze me just as certainly as the child had. That freeze gave the rest of them the chance they needed. They surrounded me, gliding out of the woods like they were on rollers. Dozens of them. Dozens and dozens of them. I reached for the controls, trying to set the mecha back on its automated path to the shaman. My finger never made it. There was a blinding headache. It grew and grew like a supernova. I didn't know how it could hurt more. It hurt more. It is possible to mind rape an immortal, I discovered, if you don't care about the immortal's mind when it's all over. Part 4. Turn back, turn back. Dad handed me the delicate hydraulic piston, still warm from the printer. You know where this goes, right? He was sweating in the June heat. Keeping all of Comerica Park air-conditioned, even with the dome, was impossible, especially during one of those amazingly wet Midwestern heat waves. I know, Dad, I said. I can fix this thing in my sleep, you know. He smiled at me, then switched to a mock frown. Well, I used to think that, but given your recent treatment of one of my prize machines... He gestured at the remains of the big mecha blasted open in the battle for Detroit. Oh, Dad, I said, what did you want me to do? Let them raid us? You know, I took down 8 of them, single-handedly. The flea bounced me, landing on my shoulders and leaping away. I staggered and would have dropped the piston had Dad not caught me. You had some help, he said. He gave me a hug. It's okay, you know. You were brave and amazing. I love you. I love you too, I said. It was awkward saying it, but it felt good. Good, he said. Now, back to work, you. I'm not paying you to stand around. You're paying me? When was the last time you paid rent? You're getting this in trade. The carousel sat in the middle of the field where second base had been. We dug it in, setting it flush to the ground the way it was supposed to be. It looked great, but it made reaching the maintenance areas a bit of a pain. We'd winched out the entire Jimmy's bedroom assembly and put it on the turf next to the carousel. Poor Jimmy, one of his arms hung to one side, jerking spastically when I powered him up. I unbuttoned his shirt, fumbled with the unfamiliar fasteners, and undressed him. The arm hydraulics were not easy to get at. Man, screws sucked. I tossed them in the air as I got them free, letting Ike and Mike fetch to snatch them out of the sky. Aren't you afraid you'll lose one? I looked up from my work. Lacey looked prettier than ever, wearing a sleeveless shirt and a pair of shorts that showed off her hips, which had really changed shape in the past couple months, all for the better. Geez, I said, don't sneak up on me like that. She gave me a playful shove, and I shoved her back, and she snuck me a kiss. I broke it off. Not in front of my dad, I said, pleading. Your dad adores me, don't you, Harv? I turned around, and there he was, wiping his hands on his many pocketed work shorts, then tugging his shirt out of his belt loop and pulling it on. You'll do, he said. I set the piston down carefully. It sank a few inches below the surface. I tried to pretend that it hadn't happened. Pepe flew over us, then swooped in for a landing. His aim was off, though. He swooped right at my chest, then went right through my chest. Damn it, I said. It's okay, Lacey said. They'll fix it. Let's go for a walk. I can't, I said. I just can't do it. If the spatial stuff isn't working, I can't believe it. Debugging is a process. We'll file a bug against it. They'll have it fixed soon enough. Look, I said, if the platform is so buggy that it can't even keep track of collisions, how do we know it's running us accurately? Of course it's not running us accurately, she said. Otherwise you'd still hate my guts, your dad would still be dead, Dad nodded, and you'd still be like 400 years old. Can't you just be happy for once? You keep telling me that things will get better. So forget about a great big beautiful tomorrow, Jimmy, Dad said. Maybe they'll never debug it. But tell me that now isn't the best time of your life. I tried to argue. I couldn't. Whether that was because there was a bug in me, or because he was right, I couldn't say.